Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tonellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Affirm Press. Listeners, I may have mentioned once or twice on the podcast before that I'm a huge francophile. I speak, read and write French, although perhaps less fluently or well than I do in my dreams. I will absolutely stand in line for a good croissant or a macaron, and a visit to France was at the top of my wish list on my first solo adventure after finishing high school. So whenever I have the chance to read a book that takes me back to France or immerses me in the sensory heaven that is French food and wine, I'll savour it like a glass of Moet and Chandon. And so when a book called Eat Your Heart Out set in France crossed my desk earlier this year, I knew it was going to be something I would enjoy. Published by Affirm Press in February this year, Eat Your Heart Out was to me an Emily in Paris meets Julie and Julia, a book about French food and culture, about blogging, and it's set against the backdrop of Paris and the French Riviera. Written by Victoria Brownlee, writer and editor with experience as a food critic and an international bestselling author of novels that include Fromage à Trois and Brioche in the Oven, Eat Your Heart Out is a delightful novel that I gobbled up faster than a wedge of camembert. And today I'm excited to have the chance to speak with this talented author on the podcast today. Welcome, Victoria.
It's so nice to be here.
It's so wonderful to have you. And I want to say congratulations on your novel.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been out for almost a month now, so it's exciting. It's very, very exciting to have it out in the world.
That's wonderful. Now, this is your first novel to be released in Australia. So I wanted to ask you, how did that come about? And will the novel also be released elsewhere like your other two?
So I moved back to Australia. I'd been living overseas for almost a decade. So I moved back a couple of years ago. And it's pretty much as soon as I moved back, I started writing this novel. So I wrote it in my first year back in Australia. And it's funny, I used it, I think, as a way of dealing with homesickness. I think as I would write, I would picture myself still in France. So it was really a way to keep that French-Australia connection alive. And because my protagonist is Australian, I was able to write imagining that I was her at times. So it felt like a very nice remedy for homesickness. But yes, so Eat Your Heart Out, because I was home, because I was in Australia, I wanted to pitch the book in Australia. I have an agent who is based in Paris, and he thought it would be a great opportunity to really pitch in Australia and to try and build a community and a network here. And so he started pitching it to publishers in Australia, and it was picked up by Affirm Press.
How wonderful. And Victoria, as I mentioned in my intro, you've worked as a food critic yourself. So, what was that like? Is it as glamorous as it sounds?
It's a job that I think it's more a lifestyle than a job, actually. It's just so all-encompassing. So I would have days when I was out for breakfast, lunch, afternoon tea and dinner. And then, you'd go to a bar, you'd do a little bar review at the end of the evening. So you would spend your day just consuming, and you lived in this world that was just all, new openings, tastings, and it was so much fun. It was very glamorous. But as I came to 2 years of doing it, I really thought, okay, this is getting tiring. And I found myself being really drawn to simple foods and eating, behind my office in Shanghai, we had it was a little dumpling soup place, and they would make this incredible bowl of dumplings. And I would go there, and I think it was about $2 or $3 for a bowl. And that's what I ended up craving. So I found that a lot of the pleasure of eating out became tied up in my work. And I think that I needed a break from the constant consumption, which was my life. So yeah, it's a good problem to have, obviously, but at the end I did feel as though I was craving simplicity and probably a healthier lifestyle as well.
I can totally understand that. But as you say, it was a good problem to have at the time.
It was so much fun. I wouldn't change the experience for anything.
Oh, I love it. Now, did you always think that you would one day write a novel involving people who wrote about food for a living?
No, I didn't. But I think, sometimes when you're planning a novel and you start writing it, I don't think that you necessarily think how much of your experience is coming into it. And as you get through the novel and then you come back to it, perhaps, you're editing it with fresh eyes, you start to recognize all these parts of your life that you've woven into the story, perhaps unintentionally. So I think it wasn't really yeah, it wasn't a planned thing to write about food writers in a novel, but it came about quite organically and it felt so natural. I think having come across, such a diverse group of people when I was writing about food, I did really want to play into those stereotypes and bring some of those out into the novel. And I think it was a lot of fun because of that.
Mm. Yeah, indeed. And it did really feel natural. And it felt like this was your space. You really knew what you were talking about.
Thank you. That's so nice. It's nice that that comes across because yeah, it was such a big part of my life, and I think playing it out on paper, obviously, my experiences were very different to that of my characters. I think I gave them a bit of a hard time, but but I do think that it was fun to relive some moments, some of the more comical moments of my time as a critic. It was enjoyable.
As I mentioned to you before we started recording, this was a terrifically entertaining novel with a cast of intriguing characters, some more likable than others, I have to say. But for those who haven't discovered Eat Your Heart Out yet, Victoria, I was wondering if you could tell me more about the story.
Okay, so we start in Paris. There are six food writers who get invited to a dinner at Carla Juris's restaurant. Now, Carla Juris is a celebrity chef in France. Her father was Jean Juris. He was very, very famous. He died suddenly of a heart attack, and Carla took over his restaurant in Paris. So she invites this group of food writers to her restaurant, and they don't really know why they're going. And then during the dinner at Carla Juris's, they get invited to interview to write her memoir. So all the participants who agree to the interview process, they get invited down to Carla's villa, which is in the south of France. So they take a night train down and then they go to the villa. And Carla puts them through what I could describe as a sort of competition in order to find who will be the best memoir writer for her.
A really terrific premise. And as I said earlier, it reminded me of both Emily in Paris and Julie and Julia. It's about Chloe, who's this expat Australian trying to navigate life in Paris, but she also does this by starting a food blog and she starts reviewing places to eat in Paris. And to her delight, that blog comes to the attention of some quite notable figures in the industry. And she doesn't feel comfortable or as deserving as some of the other people who are invited, as you say, to interview for this coveted position. She doesn't feel comfortable, I would say, as both an Australian, but also as not having a more established position with the culinary world. And so, in your experience, would you say that there's an established hierarchy in this space?
Oh, absolutely. I think in food writing there's definitely a hierarchy. You have your people from traditional media who are viewed completely differently to your bloggers. And I think that while everyone can be invited to write a review or to a tasting, I do think that there is different treatment amongst these different groups. And I love the idea of Chloe being a blogger and that element of feeling, out of her depth and being the fish out of water. I think it was really fun to write from that perspective because so often as writers, we feel like we're not supposed to be there. We have imposter syndrome. And I think that I think that was part of her charm, that she felt like she didn't really belong. So she really worked hard to be in the interview process. And I don't think she took her position for granted at all, which I think is a nice way to approach something like this. Whereas some of the other characters, their arrogance just shone through immediately. And I think that has to do with where they worked and who they were and their upbringing and, their family connections. Whereas Chloe didn't have that. So she was really out there fighting by herself, and I liked that for her. I think it showed her strength and determination, and I think it allowed her to really show who she was as a character by the fact that she was really just doing it all by herself.
Tell me more about Chloe and your inspiration for writing her. I mean, in the book, she's a Tassie girl. She studied in Melbourne before heading to France, and she seems determined to make her life there, despite her parents constantly asking her to come back home.
Well, it's funny. I didn't necessarily intend this, but Chloe and I do share an origin story. I didn't grow up in Tasmania, but I did grow up in country Victoria, and a lot of my family is Tasmanian. So I spent a bit of time there. I think, going to Melbourne straight after high school to study, it was a similar thing that Chloe went through. And, it takes a while to find your people. And I think for Chloe, that was the case as well. And then she started this love affair with French food through Carla Juris and the Juris family and their cookbooks that led her to go to France to really try and start a career. We have stuff in common. We both wrote a food blog and we both wanted to turn that into more of a career. So I think the inspiration for Chloe's I guess, career trajectory is somewhat similar to mine. And I think she just does it with a little more finesse than I've done mine. I've made a few more mistakes along the way, which I'm quite happy to admit to. I do think she's, I guess, an interesting character in her own right as well. You know, the things she ends up doing is so different to what I've ended up doing. But I think she has that connection to home and that connection to Australia that I have, and that I guess that comes through all my characters. You know, it's like having your heart in two places. Her heart is with her family in Australia, but it's also in France and with everything she's doing for herself and for her career over there. So I think, you know, she's pulled in both directions. And I think that's such a common thing for people who live overseas and who have spent time overseas. You know, it's like, where is my heart? Okay, no, it's just in both places.
I don't know if this is a spoiler to talk about Chloe when she has an opportunity to cook something and she chooses something that is so quintessentially Australian. And it really does show where her heart lies. I've eaten a Tasmanian scallop pie, and there is honestly nothing better. You were talking a little bit earlier about simple food, just craving simple food. And when you said that, it immediately brought to mind the thing that Chloe chose to cook, which I think you would say was quite simple.
But there's beauty in simplicity, and simple things done well. I don't think you can beat it. The thing I craved the most while I was living in France, it was 6 years, it was just lamingtons, hot cross buns, yo-yos. There were a little selection of sweet foods that I would just crave all the time. And I think Chloe just had to make something Australian. It just felt so right for her. I actually felt sorry for her in a way, because cooking for a chef is a very, very difficult thing to do. Where she went right, or where things went right for her, is that she chose to cook something that was so Australian and that wouldn't have been expected. And I think she won in the end.
Now, one thing that Chloe thinks or says in the novel concerns the cutthroat nature of food/restaurant reviews, and her approach is not as hardcore as some of the other food writers who are there. And she notes that sometimes chefs have bad days. And is it fair, I guess, to slam a chef's reputation if the food isn't absolutely perfect the day that you happen to be there? So tell me why Chloe believes this. And is this how you approached your reviews when you were a food critic?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that this is such an interesting comment on food writing and critiquing in general. I think for me, when I was critiquing, it was always anonymous, and I would always try and visit everywhere that I reviewed at least twice, sometimes more. And I think to have that, I guess, the research behind it and the multitude of experiences, you know, I think in order to write a negative review about someone, there was a lot that played into my writing of that. And I was never like, I never went for shock value. That's just not my style. And the clickbaity stuff, that's just not how I see myself as a writer. It's not something that I would ever want to do. It's the tricky thing with critiquing. You know, everyone's a critic. Everyone who has a phone, who has a social media account, everyone can be a critic now. And I do think that restaurants can have off days, like people, like, you know, like writers, like journalists as well. And I think requires just a little more nuance than it is given a lot of times. But then, you know, from the other perspective, you can side with the paying diner. You know, someone is paying for this experience. The experience should be good and consistent. So I guess that was something to grapple with as a critic. I do think that you have to be careful to see both perspectives. Chloe was really good at that, but then she just loved writing about food. Like, her take on food writing was always trying to find the positives. And I don't think she wasn't in it for the negative review or the negative critique. And Henri, who she meets, struggles with this, because obviously the reviews that do well for Henri are the negative reviews. And that's what he's competing against with some characters like Balthazar. And so I think that she sort of sees that in him, and that's something he struggles with. So I think that's sort of an interplay that they both have to contend with.
So interesting, Victoria, because I mean, I guess for me, it kind of got me thinking about book reviews too. Like chefs, authors can spend many years of their lives working on their craft, and indeed the process of getting a book out in the world can often be lengthy, and there are readers out there who can be utterly scathing in their reviews, and indeed post reviews that actively prevent someone else from wanting to read the book, which, like a restaurant, can kind of make or break a career or a business or whatever. So I guess I wanted to ask you then, do you think reviewers have a responsibility where reviews are concerned, whether it's books or restaurants?
I've been thinking more about this as well recently because, and I think absolutely people have a responsibility, but does that mean that they can't be honest?
Mm.
Look, I think if you're going to slam something, be it, a book or a restaurant, I think as long as you're doing it, understanding, as long as you have the full picture, and as long as you're doing it and prefacing it perhaps with a personal opinion or, a little bit of research, I think that there is, I guess, a responsibility to not just slam something for the sake of slamming it, but to have, I guess, a little more thought behind it. It's a tricky one because, there are books you don't like, there are restaurants you won't like, and I think that you have a right to express those opinions, but I think it just needs to be done carefully. Otherwise, it's people's feelings that, and people's
Livelihoods.
livelihood and exactly, and people's dreams as well. I don't think that can be ignored. I think it's such a complicated question, but I don't know. I think it also just has to be true to who you are as a person when you're reviewing something. If you love the drama and you want the attention, I think the negative review can work quite nicely. But there's a bit of give and take, isn't there? It's just authors
Mm.
expect bad reviews. They expect, well, they hopefully expect some good reviews. Restaurants must expect some bad reviews. I think it is part of being in the public arena that people will comment on you, and you can't control that. And removing yourself from that process as, an author or a business owner, I think is something that you have to learn to do pretty early on. Otherwise, I think your ego could be shattered quite quickly.
Indeed, if we've got any ego left.
That's a good point.
Saying that, I totally understand your point. And so then I kind of want to talk about Carla Juris, who is the chef that Chloe gets to interview for with the prospect of working on this very exciting project. Now, Chloe, as you said, she's kind of idolized this chef and her family for years. And she kind of found her way by reading the cookbooks. And that sort of like inspires her to go to Paris. Now, Carla is an intriguing character, first because no one really seems to know much about her except that she's this hugely famous and wealthy chef, and secondly because of this kind of cloak and dagger routine that she makes the six food writers go through to interview for this particular job. Now, was she based on a chef or chefs that you had met or that you knew about? Or
Oh, I'm happy to say that Carla Juris is her own person. Um, she has some characteristics that I did see in chefs. A lot of chefs, like a lot of people in the public eye, will have a persona which is for the public and then a persona which is, you know, behind the scenes. And I think that I really enjoyed exploring that idea of, what is Carla putting out there into the public? And she's not without scandal. I think, there's a lot going on around Carla that the writers are aware of, but also what they're willing to ignore in order to perhaps get a job with her to ride her coattails and to become more famous. So I think it's this interesting thing about celebrity and the idea behind celebrity and what you're willing to do for a slice of that fame. And I think that was interesting to me. And I think Carla as a character, I wanted her to not be immediately clear. And I wanted her intentions to not be always very clear. And I think that's why I had Max, her assistant, along for the ride with her, because he was there as the face, and then Carla was sort of the mystery behind the whole thing. I really enjoyed the intrigue of their relationship and then how they approached the food writers as well.
I think now you might say that I'm reading too much into it, but I think there is something in there about meeting your idols. It's not always what you imagine it's going to be, is it?
Oh no, that's just life, isn't it? I think you build things up in your head, and I think I felt sorry for Chloe. I think the Carla that she had in her head was such a better idol than the Carla she ended up meeting, and so often with people in life, we can do this. We can build them up and they can become, you know, almost the perfect person. And then we meet them and then we're like, oh no, they're human. They've got flaws. You know, they've got their own personality. The personality doesn't match what I already knew about them. Their public persona is completely different. Behind closed doors, this person is actually completely nuts. Like, these are realities. And I think a lot of people get that when they meet their idols. And I think that what a fall from grace. It's so hard. Oh, I almost feel guilty for putting my characters through it.
I have to say, I felt the same way once I met a celebrity chef. I won't say the name. I was horrified.
Oh, what did they do?
Just bad behavior, I think. And to some extent, there is shock and entertainment value of, you know, watching people have that persona, that television persona, and then, you know, to meet them in real life and know that people like us who kind of revere them and put them up on these pedestals feed into that, you know, makes the ego even bigger than it initially was. And then you have to sit back and go, well, I can't really continue to support somebody who's as awful as that.
And that's hard, isn't it? It's, you know, because you can like the work someone produces, but you don't have to like the way they act or they behave or the way they behave towards you. I think, you know, and sometimes it's that separation of, you know, art and the person that is behind it.
And the lines get blurred though on Instagram, you know, Insta famous people and people that become famous because their craft and their art becomes appealing worldwide. Those lines can be very blurred.
She's come to France, I think, in part because of Carla. And then to really find out Carla's true colours, I guess it was cruel of me.
At the heart of this novel, Victoria, is a love story and overcoming preconceptions about, you know, another person. Henri comes from food critiquing royalty and he writes for a very well-respected paper. Chloe thinks he's quite pompous and probably doesn't take her work as a food blogger very seriously, especially as it's an unpaid venture. And they were in direct competition for the job of their dreams. Can you tell me more about their journey and what you hope to explore with these two characters?
I just love the idea of cross-cultural breakdowns in communication. I think it's such a rich field to explore. And I think that so often things go wrong just because you misinterpret something that someone says or does. And so I think for Chloe, you know, she has her own insecurities about her blog and the fact she's a blogger and, you know, the fact that she perhaps feels like she doesn't have a right to be at the table with the other food critics. And I think that she brings that into all her interactions with Henri. And then I think Henri, he's obviously grappling with the idea that he doesn't want to do what he's doing currently. And I think that he's trying to approach Chloe with this sort of sympathetic and kind nature that she just completely misinterprets. They both have their own ideas of how they want the weekend to go. And I think that that's part of the fun between them because obviously they just keep getting in each other's way. Like they're drawn to each other, but then they're also trying to understand each other. And then there's also this attraction. So I think there's just a lot of room for error with the two of them. And as the novel goes on, I think their intentions become clearer, but at the same time, it's like, are they intentions that are sabotaging the other person or are they authentic? I think it was hard for them in their positions to actually think, okay, this person is being genuine or authentic because they were in direct competition.
Obviously, you did spend quite a bit of time in France, but I was wondering if you'd done any particular interesting research for this novel. Did you take a trip to the Riviera specifically? I mean, that's pretty tough work, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. A lot of my novel research is really, really tough work. Yeah, a lot of French food consumption, glasses of wine on terraces and on the French Riviera. Yes, so I had the idea for the novel when I was on a long weekend trip in the south of France. So as we were driving around, my husband and I and my kids were in the back, as we were driving around the Cap d'Antibes, I was looking at all these villas with their giant gates, essentially shut off to people like me. And I was thinking, okay, who lives behind these gates? And how can I start to explore a little bit of their world, which obviously is now fictionalized. But there was just, I was drawn to the luxury and the inaccessibility of the whole environment down there because it's so wealthy. It's an incredibly wealthy part of France. And, as you're driving around, you can understand why. It is absolutely picturesque. It's just beyond beautiful. And so I think that trip really inspired the setting for this book. And obviously starting it in Paris, that felt easy because, Paris is Paris. Eating in restaurants in Paris is also just so wonderful. And so I think, yeah, and then having them go on a night train down to the south of France, it felt like a new location from my previous novels. And that was fun to explore as well because setting is so important to me as a writer. And I think where my books are set, they're all set in France, but it's so rich and it plays into how the characters act, how they behave, and just the whole story. It feels like an integral part of the book.
I completely agree with you. It is integral and it comes alive on the pages of this book. As I said, I'm so immersed in Chloe's experiences of being, this passionate food consumer in Paris, and then, her experiences on the Riviera as well. Victoria, as mentioned, this isn't your first novel, and you have two others which have been translated into a number of foreign languages, and one of them has even been adapted as a Hallmark movie. I'm so fascinated to learn about. Can you tell us a little bit more about those other two books and the movie?
So, Fromage à Trois was a book that I started working on a really long time ago, and I sort of worked on it in pieces, and then I ended up moving to China and working as a food critic. So it got put on hold. And then after China, we moved to France and I picked up the novel again and I thought, right, let's just finish it. Obviously, finishing a novel is easier said than done. So I worked on it for a number of months. Obviously, I had to try a lot of cheese, visit a lot of restaurants in Paris. There was a lot of intense research that went into that novel as well. But then I met with my now agent in Paris after pitching it around a little. And he said, look, I love the title, Fromage à Trois. I'd love to represent you. From there, he got the book deal in Germany, which then sparked the book deal in the UK. And then the US followed after that and a number of translations. So it was just, I think it felt like a really lucky break. I know that not everyone's first novel gets picked up. So I really did feel like I had a lot of luck on my side for that. And then the second book was the sequel to the first, Brioche in the Oven, in which the characters, the protagonists from the first book, moved to the Loire Valley. So a new setting in France for them. A few years later, time goes on, and then my agent sort of said to me, oh, I have a producer who's got your book. They're quite interested in it. And I said, oh, this is huge. Okay. But he's always prefacing his information to me with don't get excited. I do have a tendency to get overexcited. So he prefaced it with don't get excited. Nothing may come of this. However, there is a producer who'd like to pitch a book. And so I met with the producers and they told me their vision for the novel adaptation. It was just fabulous. I felt like the novel would be in such good hands with them. I said, okay, let's run with it. And so they pitched it around and then Hallmark picked it up. And so obviously when you get your movie deal, they buy the option. And so there's no guarantee that a film will ever be made. So I did a little research. I didn't know a lot about the process. So I did a little research thinking, okay, I shouldn't get excited about this part either. However, I did read somewhere that Hallmark quite often ends up making the movies that they option. That's just part of their business. And so quite a lot of the movies that they option get turned into films. And I thought, okay, this is exciting. And so we sold the option. And then it probably was 6 months later, I just found out of the blue that they were going to make the film. It had been greenlit. It was going ahead and it would be out within 6 to 8 weeks. So it was quite shocking. So the producers went to Europe. They filmed it. It had Bethany Joy Lenz in it, which was very exciting because I grew up watching One Tree Hill. So obviously when I found out she was playing Ella, I was just so excited. I could have cried. I was like, this is just incredible. This feels very legitimate. Yeah, the process, it was all just really exciting, but I was very removed from it. And so I sort of sat waiting, thinking, okay, there's this big thing that's happening that I'm not a part of, and it's my work. However, I have no say in it anymore. And so it was quite nerve-wracking until I saw the promo clip for the film. I was apprehensive as to how the adaptation would go. But the promo was incredible. It was so utterly charming that I just honestly I just fell in love with the main characters, and I thought the actors playing, they just felt so perfectly cast, and it just seemed like it was going to be okay. And so then after the promo clip came out a few weeks later, I watched the actual film, and it was incredible. And I think it's obviously really strange to watch your work being adapted to film, because as a writer, I write with image, like very strong images in my head, and I think that so many of them corresponded really well with what ended up going into the film. Others, though, others were completely off. But I think as a whole, the film worked so beautifully, and it's a really fun adaptation. And while some of the cheeses aren't perhaps the cheeses I would have, it's a very cheese-heavy film. While some of the cheeses aren't the cheeses I would have chosen to highlight in the film, I think overall the effect is perfect.
Wonderful. And if people wanted to look that film up, what's it called?
Savouring Paris.
Victoria, you might know that there are a lot of writers who listen to this podcast. And so I wanted to know if you might offer some tips to writers out there who are looking to get that first break and become a published novelist.
It's always a hard question, isn't it? Because I think there's so much luck that plays into the process. But I think some things that really helped me would have been taking time out, if you can, to work on a novel in, I guess, a block of time. I think that really, really helped me sort of get to that end point. I think if you can go on a writing workshop or attend a course, or even just take, any amount of time that you can, if you can carve out some time specifically to work on the manuscript, just so you can really get deep into it. I think that's when I was sort of able to finish writing my first novel. And I think I needed that time and that headspace and that mental clarity just to be focused on that. I think it would have been very hard to finish while I was working in another job or in another role. So I guess having a little bit of time to work on something, or to finish something even, I think is really important. And then just reading as much about writing craft as you can, and or taking short courses. I think that's all really beneficial, because there's always so much work you can do in terms of characters and plotting, and I guess editing as well. Like editing for me, I always think, when I like to think I'm finished editing a novel, is when I start from the very beginning and edit it again the whole way through. As a writer, you are ready for someone else to be looking at it and contributing to it. However, I think it always needs another edit. And that's my motto for myself. I'm always like, okay, just one more. It feels painful at the time, but it's always worth it. I think, again, if you can edit in a block of time, I think it's so important for the continuity of the story. At least I think in my brain, that's how I need to view it. And then just keep writing. Always just keep writing.
Some really wonderful tips in there. So, Victoria, are you working on something else at the moment?
Yes, this is a tricky question. I wrote a novel I wrote a manuscript, I should say, before Eat Your Heart Out, which I'm revisiting now. So it's again set in France. There is a food theme running through it. However, it's less of a romance. So I'm having a little look at that in the early stages of launching into another edit. And then I've got an idea for a little book set in Paris, but that is in very early stages of just really thinking on it. Just trying to enjoy the publication process of Eat Your Heart Out first, which, is probably the worst advice, I think, to give people. Don't, always have something new on the go, so you don't completely have to focus on what you're currently doing. We're not good at listening to advice, are we, as people?
So, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from Eat Your Heart Out, what would that be?
I guess just be careful who your idols are. I think that's only advice that's come through this conversation as well. Just watch out who you like. No, watch your back. I don't know. No, it's not like that. I do think, from a writing perspective, having a lot of fun with characters. And these characters really took me for a ride in the end. I was not expecting this from them. And I think that, they really steered the ship for the last third of this book. And I think as a writer, just letting your characters really do what they want, and then feeling comfortable enough with the process to let them let loose. And as a reader, I think the takeaway is just to book your trip to France. Go visit the French Riviera. That's probably what I would really like people to do. Go have a really nice holiday.
Victoria, it's been such fun chatting to you about this absolutely delightful book. I wish you every success with it. And thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.